Hello health champions. Today we're going to talk about what would happen if you didn't drink any water. And we'll cover the real reason water is so important and how much you really need to drink. You might be surprised. This here is a water molecule, and it is arguably the most important molecule that we know of. This is the oxygen and these are the hydrogens. So we got H2O. The planet is about 70% covered in water. The human adult body consists of about 60% water, this little molecule right here. The soft tissues in the body are about 70 to 80% water, and even things that seem dry, like bone, are about 30% water. And the reason we're even alive lies in the word water soluble. So when we look at this molecule, there's an angle. The hydrogens are pushed apart at an angle of 104.5 degrees. And because of that, water is the universal solvent. If these two hydrogen molecules would have been in a straight line, if this angle was 180 degrees, life as we know it could not exist. All life depends on the fact that water can dissolve more than anything else on the planet. And the reason life depends on water is that everything that we want to transport around dissolves in that water. Inside our cells, our entire metabolism, virtually all chemical reactions in your body takes place in an aqueous solution, in a water-soluble base. And these chemical reactions, when they're done, they produce waste that also needs to be transported and eliminated through this water-soluble system. And even though water supports everything that happens in the body, the functions, in my opinion, falls basically in three categories. And the first one is temperature regulation. The body is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And we'd like to keep it that way. And the blood, which is mostly water, also distributes heat. The core is the warmest portion, so as the blood flows, it distributes that heat as well. And if it wants to conserve heat, then it transports less. It circulates less blood to the periphery, and it preserves the heat at the core. If there is too much heat and the body is trying to get rid of it, then it will circulate that heat to the surface so it can radiate off to the external environment. But then water also serves one more function because it can evaporate. When we sweat, then it costs energy to evaporate that water. So if we have moisture on the skin and it turns into gas, that costs energy, so we can cool off the body with that mechanism. Function number two is basically everything else. And you can read various different lists where they talk about the functions of water, how important it is, such as lubricating joints, nourishing the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord, how it moistens tissues such as mucous membranes, how it supports your GI tract. And then I had to laugh about this one, that it prevents dehydration. That's really profound, that if dehydration means you don't have enough water, then water can solve the problem of not having enough water. I mean, that's really profound. Wow. But the lists go on and on and on. And the reason I'm making a little bit of fun out of this is that it makes really no sense to list certain functions as depending on water when everything in the body depends on water. Every single chemical reaction that happens in your cells and in your blood and the distribution and so forth, they all depend on water. So this list really is millions of items long. The third function is waste elimination. And this one also fits within that category of everything else, but I wanted to mention this separately because it is just that important, and we're going to come back and cover this separately. Now, the reason that you need to add water all the time is that we keep losing it. And here's how we lose it. We lose 2 to 3 liters per day at rest. So we're going to talk about when this goes up or down also. In the urine, you lose about 1.5 liters per day. In sweat, you lose another 0.5 liter. Through breathing, you lose about 0.5 liter. And then through your bowel movements, you also lose about 0.2 liters. Now, what we want to keep in mind that there's a huge variation here. I put plus minus 500%. So if you drink 2 gallons, then the urine is going to go up dramatically. If you're working outside in the heat, the sweating is going to go up dramatically. If you exercise, loss to breathing is going to go up dramatically. And if you have diarrhea or if you eat foods with lots of fiber that hold lots of water, then this number will go up as well. So we need to understand that these numbers have an enormous amount of variety to them. And just like everything else, the body is really good at regulating the amount of fluid in the body. And it's one of the most important things that it does. So when we have a circumstance of not enough water, then there's a place in the brain called the hypothalamus that senses that the concentration of particles have changed. So if the concentration of particles go up, that means we need to dilute it with more water. We need more water. So the brain, the hypothalamus, says we need to release more ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. And it does exactly what it says. A diuretic is something that pushes water out. So anti-diuretic is something that holds water in. And it's the kidneys that does this. So the kidneys normally filter out about 200 liters of water, but then it reabsorbs about 99.5% of that, so that we only eliminate about 1.5 liters. But if the ADH goes up, when the hypothalamus says we need to hold on to this water, then the percentage goes even higher than 99.5%. And at the same time, this also signals thirst, because the hypothalamus says, hey, we better preserve what we have, but let's try to find ways to increase the intake also. If we, on the other hand, have too much water, now there's a couple of other mechanisms. The first one is called pressure diuresis. So when we have too much water, the blood volume is larger. It's going to increase the blood pressure, and it's going to push more fluid out through the kidneys all by itself, just mechanical pressure. And then at the same time, the hypothalamus releases less anti-diuretic hormones, so now the kidney retention goes down. It's not going to reabsorb as much because we have too much. But here's basically what happens. These are the consequences of not having enough water. So if we look at a scale from totally hydrated, 0% water loss, then as we go down, we have 2% water loss. The first thing that's going to happen is thirst. At this point, we might start getting a little tired. We have a little bit less athletic performance, but no huge consequence except that the hypothalamus is so sensitive, it's already picking up that there's a problem and tries to get more water in by signaling thirst. But if we don't get to drink and this water loss continues, now we start seeing things like a loss of energy. We're going to have, our mood is going to suffer. We're going to see a reduction in skin elasticity, and the skin is going to start looking more dry and sunken. We're going to have a loss of cognition. We're going to be less able to focus and concentrate and think clearly. And all of these are going to continually get worse as the water loss increases, but they're going to be very significant by the time we have about a 6% water loss. And then by the time we've lost about 8% of the water in the body, now we're going to start feeling lightheaded and have fainting spells. We're going to be very close to fainting. And the big reason for that is that we just don't have enough water in the blood anymore to fill out the cardiovascular system. So it's very difficult for the heart to pump the blood up from the heart to the head. And if this continues to about 10%, we're going to start seeing organ failure. And by the time we're at 15% water loss, then most people are going to be dead by that time. But why do we die if we stop drinking water? What's the mechanism for that? Why is it that we only have a few to several days to live without water? And there's a couple of scenarios. So with acute dehydration, this could be a marathon runner, someone who runs a marathon in Death Valley and doesn't replenish. It could be someone who is lost in the desert, someone who is very hot and they're losing water very quickly. Now, most of these chemical functions, most of these organs are going to start failing simply because there's not enough water to support these chemical reactions. There's not enough fluid, there's not enough circulation to carry this out. Everything starts becoming too congested and too stagnant. But there's another mechanism that I think is much more interesting for the average person who's not lost in the desert or trying to run a marathon in excessive heat. And that is, what's the mechanism for the slow loss? What is it that's harming us? And basically remember that all of the chemical reactions in the body, they use some kind of substrate like carbohydrate or protein or fat, and then we turn that into energy, we turn it into building blocks. But all these chemical reactions, they produce waste products. There's some residue left over from those, and the body has to get rid of that somehow. And the kidney is the organ that needs to filter that out and then to reabsorb the water. So when it reabsorbs the clean water, then it's basically concentrating the waste products, the particles, into the urine. And the less water we have, the less fresh water we have added to the body, the harder the kidneys have to try to concentrate, the more energy it has to expend in concentrating the urine. But not only that, there's a physiological limit to how much the kidney can concentrate that. And here's how this concentration works in the body. It's called plasma osmolarity, and it's basically a measurement of how many particles are dissolved per volume of liquid. So if we have a certain number of particles at baseline, this would be the average concentration in the body. And the typical concentration for humans, and probably most mammals at least, is about 300 millimoles per liter. So just think of that as 300 particles per a certain volume. But then in the kidneys, they have a filtering system. So they're trying to push these particles into tubules, into smaller compartments. So these particles are forced, they're pressed using energy through a pumping system. And we're trying to get as many of these particles into the tubules for excretion, and this represents that concentrated urine. But there's a limit to how much the body can concentrate it, and the physiological limit for humans is about 1,200 particles. So the capacity for human kidneys to concentrate is about fourfold. The average is about 300 particles. The limit we can push it into is 1,200 particles. And beyond that limit, it becomes impossible for the kidneys to purify the blood any further without adding more fresh water. So as the kidneys fail to push more in, we're eliminating the most concentrated urine we can, but we still can't keep up. There is more waste being produced, and the body gets more and more toxic. More waste products are building up. And for humans, that number is 1,200 because that works for us based on our environment. But what about some other animals? Well, camels, for example, it's a very large animal, but it lives in very dry conditions. So the camel has the ability to concentrate that urine twice as much. It can concentrate it not fourfold, but eightfold, and that allows it to live on much less water. Dolphins that live in the ocean can concentrate up to about 1,800 because there's tons and tons of water in the ocean, obviously, but the seawater itself starts off at an osmolarity of about 1,000 particles. So humans can't use seawater because it's so close to our limit. But an animal that has a much higher margin above that of seawater, they can actually use and get water out of seawater. Another interesting example is beavers, who can only do 520 because they have access to water all the time, but it's fresh water. So they have plenty of resources to constantly flush that out, and they don't need the ability to concentrate it very much. And then we have the world champion at this, which is the Australian hopping mouse. It's a small animal and it lives in the desert. And it has the capacity to concentrate it up to 9,000 millimoles. And this allows it to preserve water and survive on basically just drops of water every day. So how much water do you need to drink? Well, the exact answer is you need to drink enough. And this is going to vary greatly, and we'll talk about how it varies. So if you're not drinking any water at all, I would suggest that you start drinking some water. It's a really good thing to do. And a lot of people always ask that I have this relative or my dad or I know this person who never ever drinks any water. They haven't had a drop of water for 50 years. How are they even alive? And it's because the body can take water from anything that has water in it. So water is the best thing to drink because water has no particles. The osmolarity of water is 0. So it's the best thing to start diluting the body fluids, the body waste products. And other liquids count as well. So if you drink coffee, if you drink tea, it's not quite as good as water, but it's almost all water. And the closer you get to water, the better. So herb teas or a little squeeze of lemon, those are excellent. Again, they're not exactly as good as water, but they're pretty close. And what about other foods? Well, some food is relatively dry and other food is very, very moist. So watermelon and cucumber and a lot of water-rich foods could be 95% or more water. Most non-starchy vegetables and leafy greens are going to be more than 80% water. And your body is really, really good at picking it apart, getting rid of the fiber, extracting some nutrients, and whatever water is left is still going to be part of the pool of water in the body. So the more water-rich foods you eat, the less water you have to drink. And I'm not a huge fan of trying to pick a number, but if we're going to try to come up with a baseline, then I would say that somewhere between 1 and 3 liters is probably going to be okay for most people. So if you don't drink any water at all, then I would suggest you're probably going to be better off drinking 2 or 3 or 4 glasses per day. But more isn't necessarily better unless you need it. So 1 to 3 liters, that's about 33 to 100 ounces. And here are the adjustments that you need to make to that amount. So body size is a huge influence. If you are 4'8" or if you're 6'8", makes a big difference. If you're 80 pounds or if you're 300 pounds, makes a big difference. Your activity level makes a huge difference. If you are mostly indoors and sedentary, or if you are working out a lot or working outside in a job a lot, the temperature is going to have a huge influence because the warmer it gets, the more humid it gets, the more you're going to be sweating and losing fluid. And not only the temperature, but also the dry versus the moist air plays a huge role. So in terms of breathing, your lungs are very, very moist tissue. So if you're in a dry climate and you're pulling in very dry air into your moist lungs, that dry air is going to grab more moisture. So you're going to lose much more fluid through breathing in a dry than a moist climate. But when it comes to sweating, it's the other way around. So the purpose of sweating is evaporation. Evaporation costs the body energy. So if it's very dry, then the water evaporates very readily and we have a temperature loss. But if it's very, very moist and you're sweating and the sweat, the moisture just sticks on the skin, then basically that evaporation is not working. That sweating is not turning into a heat loss. And the extreme of that is if you're taking a hot bath, because now you're immersed in the water, and after a while when you get hot, you notice that your head starts sweating. Well, your body is still sweating, but the evaporation isn't working. So you're sweating more and more, but there is no cooling effect because there's no evaporation. And that's why it is often difficult to take a hot bath for very long, because you start feeling faint. You get overheated and you don't have a way of cooling off the body. So it's very important to replenish fluids after a hot bath like that. So keep all that in mind, but remember that the single best way to judge, there's two ways. One is simply by the frequency of how often do you go to the bathroom. If you are outside in the yard and you just drank a gallon of water, but you haven't gone to the bathroom in 6 hours, you still didn't drink enough. And if you're going to the bathroom every 30 minutes, you're probably drinking too much. So the frequency is one good indicator, and the other one is the color of your urine. Just look at it. If it looks too dark or even brownish, then you're severely dehydrated. You're not drinking enough. You're forcing the kidney to concentrate it almost as much as it's capable of. And if it's too light, if it looks like water, now you're just pushing water. You're drinking too much. You're just pushing it straight through the kidneys. And with that, you're putting extra stress on organs, and you risk losing a lot of electrolytes. So neither extreme is good for you. And just because someone said you should drink a gallon of water doesn't make it a good idea. Too much is not better. Learn to read your body, pay attention, and learn what's right for you. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.